Well, I reckon you're here because you want to learn how to compare the similarities and differences of the 4 regions of the British colonies in North America. And wouldn't you know it, that's exactly what I want to talk about. So, if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. Alright, now I can see you're positively stoked to jump right into the comparison, but put your patient pants on because I need to set the stage first so you can understand what this is all about. Now, as I mentioned in the last video, Great Britain, although they were a little late to the New World imperialization game, they got busy colonizing North America in the 17th century. And by the end of this time period, which is 1754, there were 13 distinct British colonies on the eastern coast of North America and a cluster of colonies down here in the Caribbean known as the British West Indies. Oh, and by the way, if you want to know guys to follow along with this video and all my videos, including quizzes to help you remember it all, then there's a link down below. Anyway, the thing to remember here is that most of the people who migrated to these colonies from Great Britain were, like British. They spoke English, they were generally Protestant Christians, they got all giddy when thinking about a limited monarchy as laid out by the dang Magna Carta, they loved Mr. Bean movies, you get the idea. Anyway, by the end of this period, 4 distinct regions had developed throughout the British colonial territory, and while they did have some similarities, there were a metric buttload of differences. So the question that we're about to answer in this video is how in the fresh heck did each of these regions develop such unique cultures and societies? And that is a fine question, my dear pupil, so let's get the party started in New England. Okay, to be clear, I'm going to walk through these regions geographically from north to south. Actually, that is not the chronological order in which the colonies were founded. Well, that's true, me from back there, but why don't you drink a tall glass of shut the heck up and let me explain. So we could go chronologically, but I think the spatial comparison is easier to remember, and that's why I want to do it this way. Okay, so this region right here is called New England, and by the end of the period, it would include these 5 colonies. Now, the first colony established was the Plymouth settlement in 1620, which we talked about in the last video. But by way of reminder, Plymouth was settled by a group of separatists, otherwise known as the Pilgrims, who left Great Britain in search of religious freedom and economic opportunity. And one of the big things to remember about these folks is that they mainly migrated as whole family groups. And that means they came in order to create a whole dang society, and as it turned out, they wanted that society to operate strictly according to the principles of the Christian Bible. In other words, church and state were in no way separated. The church was the state, and the state was the church. It was the sturch. Anyway, before they left their ship, they drew up and signed the Mayflower Compact, which was an agreement to form a simple government that ruled by the will of the majority, which was an unusually democratic style of governance for the time. Now, to be clear, this document was not a constitution, but it did create the conditions for self-government in the new colony, even though only the more elite adult males could participate. Now, because their goal was to establish a whole society, the Pilgrims adopted agriculture as their way of life. Now, the first year they starved real bad, and many of them died, not least because they were suspicious of the indigenous people at their borders. However, eventually they accepted help from the indigenous people who taught them some local agricultural techniques, and after that they experienced much better harvests. And so, after they figured out how to live with the land and support themselves, the Plymouth settlers eventually developed a modest economy based on the export of lumber and beaver pelts and fish. Okay, now the second major New England colony you need to know was the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It was established in 1630 by a group of about 1,000 Puritan settlers. And just like Plymouth, it was settled by family groups and organized its government and society according to the Bible, with Jesus running the show. And you couldn't get a clearer statement of purpose for this colony than a sermon from its first governor, John Winthrop. He said that the Massachusetts colony would be as a city upon a hill, which is to say everybody could look at this colony and it would be so godly and so perfect that they could use it as a template to run their own crap. Now, in this colony, all freemen who owned property could vote on policy matters, a far larger proportion of eligible voters than existed in England. And like in Plymouth, they debated their policies in town hall meetings, and the will of the majority carried the day. Now, to be clear, not just any regular schmo could be considered a freeman, but only those who held to a strict Puritan ideology. Anyway, in time, the Massachusetts colony merged with Plymouth to become a massive Puritan colonial party. But here's where I tell you that not everybody at the party was stoked about the religious intolerance that characterized the Puritan settlements. It's hard to believe, I know, but some people actually found themselves disagreeing with the strictures of Puritan authority. And I'm in the mood to give you 2 examples. First, meet our boy Roger Williams. Now, he himself was a Puritan minister in Massachusetts, but he started thinking that the complete merger of church and state was a pretty dumb idea. He also thought that religious toleration was much more befitting a society of God than religious intoleration. And as a reward for such blasphemous beliefs, he was banished from Massachusetts and founded what would later become the Rhode Island colony, which became a haven for religious dissenters. And that reminds me of a second dissenter you should know, namely Anne Hutchinson, who was all kinds of spicy. First of all, she was a woman in a society that declared men to be spiritually superior. Second, she developed the belief that everyone had equal access to inspiration from the Holy Spirit, including women. I know! Anyway, she went around teaching these things and taking a metaphorical dump on the tight religious conformity of Puritan society. So the Puritan authorities went ahead and banished her from the colony, so she set up shop in what would soon become the Rhode Island colony on Roger Williams' invitation. Okay, so just to sum up, society in the New England region was characterized by several factors. First, the social fabric of the region was deeply religious. Second, the geography included rocky soil and harsh winters, which meant that they could only engage in limited agriculture. Third, because many of these migrants arrived in family groups, they created tight-knit towns centered around the church. And fourth, their economy majored in exporting goods like fish and lumber, all of which could be found in abundance in this region. And that commerce would eventually link them economically to the other colonies and then the wider transatlantic trade. Okay, now let's move right along to the middle colonies, which included New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and Pennsylvania. And just for poops and giggles, let's start with New York. Now, if you'll recall from a previous video, this area was previously a Dutch colony by the name of New Amsterdam. And the Dutch were very much not interested in all the "we're a city on a hill and God's beacon to all of humanity" stuff going on up north. The Dutch just wanted to make money, and so New Amsterdam became a thriving commercial seaport with all kinds of different people from different cultures living there. And the whole reason I'm flapping my mouth whole about all of that is because once the British King Charles II decided to send the Duke of York to York the colony out of Dutch hands for the British, a lot of that cultural and economic character stayed with it. So New York became a thriving trading colony on account of its abundance of rivers and natural seaports. And because their geography included river valleys with rich soil, unlike the New England colonies, New York made metric buttloads of money by exporting grain. That's why this whole region became known as the bread basket. Anyway, like the Dutch settlement before it, New York became home to a diverse group of European immigrants who arrived seeking to better themselves economically. Now, eventually the king got a little saucy about the size of the New York colony, and so he divided it in 1664. And by 1702, that new section became New Jersey, which was a royal colony that shared many of the same characteristics that I mentioned about New York. And by the way, royal colony just refers to a colony in which the governor and the council were appointed directly by the monarch. And then another big deal colony in this region was Pennsylvania, founded in 1681 by William Penn. Now, Penn's ambitions for creating this colony was different from what we've seen so far. You see, Penn was a Quaker, and Quakers, otherwise known as the Society of Friends, were especially targeted for religious marginalization both in British and colonial society. Why, says you? Well, says I, Quakers emphasized individual religious experience guided not so much by the Bible or paid clergy, but rather by an inner light possessed equally by everyone. Additionally, Quakers were pacifists, which means they refused military service. And given their emphasis on spiritual equality, they refused to support Anglican clergy or churches with their tax money. So Penn decided to establish Pennsylvania as a refuge for Quaker dissenters and all other dissenters who felt the pressure for their religious beliefs. And that conviction shaped colonial society here. As pacifists, Quakers in Pennsylvania treated indigenous people with dignity, emphasizing equitable diplomacy in their dealings. Also, freedom of worship was guaranteed to all colonists who lived in Pennsylvania, although to be fair, the British government did force Penn to deny opportunities for holding office from Jews and Catholics, but that was not Penn's decision. And so, compared to the other British colonies, Pennsylvania was unusually democratic since policy decisions were made by an elected representative assembly who were chosen by landowners. And given Pennsylvania's non-discriminatory practices, the colony attracted a very diverse population. And in that environment, Pennsylvania's economic sector grew rapidly, particularly in the export of grain and other crops, which is similar to the other middle colonies. And so now let's sum up what you know about this region. First, the soil was deep and fertile, which meant that agriculture was a booming business in this region. Second, the population was way more diverse than any of the other regions because of the emphasis on religious tolerance and economic opportunity. Third, in terms of governance, the middle colonies tended to be less participatory than the town hall meetings in New England, but more participatory than what we're going to find in the South. Speaking of which, let's move right on down and talk about the Chesapeake and North Carolina region. Now, if we had been doing all of this chronologically, this is where we would have started because Jamestown was Britain's first colony established over here in 1607. Now, the main goal of the settlers at Jamestown, which was within the colony that would later become Virginia, was profit. Which is to say, they looked in their pockets and found plenty of room for some boom boom. And so most of the migrants who showed up here were single men as opposed to the family groups that settled in New England. And that should tell you that they were not at all interested in creating a society here. They just wanted to smack the soil and make it cough up all of its gold quick, fast, and in a hurry. But unfortunately for them, there wasn't much gold to be had there, and since they didn't much bother to plant crops to feed themselves, many of those first settlers starved to death. In fact, it got so bad that some of the settlers turned to cannibalism to survive. Is this Jerry? This tastes like Jerry. Is it too soon to make 17th century cannibalism jokes? I don't know. Anyway, the colony definitely turned around once John Rolfe came in and created the conditions for prosperity in Virginia by leading the colonists to plant and harvest tobacco, which created an insatiable demand in Great Britain. And while that development was great for the wealth of the colony, it also created some problems. You see, tobacco planting is real hard on the soil, and so as they planted it year after year, the soil kind of shriveled up like an old monkey's kneecap. But since the demand for tobacco was still high, that meant that the settlers needed more land on which to plant. Now, that would cause some conflicts with the indigenous people living in the region, but we'll get to that in another video. Anyway, because tobacco became the most important export of Virginia, it led to the development of sprawling plantation-style plots, which was the chief characteristic of Chesapeake colonies, which were far more agricultural compared to northern regions. Now, at first, most of the labor was completed by indentured servants, but in 1619, a Dutch ship entered the Virginia harbor and sold about 20 African indentured servants to the planters. And then gradually, African slavery would replace indentured servitude as the main labor system in these colonies. And as for governance, again, it was unusually democratic for the time period. Here they established the House of Burgesses, which acted as a representative government, and this body would inspire later forms of self-government in the colonies as well, even though participation was restricted to propertied white men. Now, North Carolina was established as a royal colony in 1712, but for our purposes, most of what I said about Virginia can also be applied to this colony as well, so I'll save your brain the effort. And that means it's time to sum up the characteristics of this region. First, the warmer weather meant that large, sprawling plantations became the defining feature of the landscape, and they majored in the export of tobacco. Second, the need for more land to plant crops led to westward expansion and conflict with indigenous peoples. Third, while the House of Burgesses represented a step toward democratic institutions, over time, politics was ruled by a small cadre of elite planters. And fourth, by the end of the period, the dominant source of labor here was enslaved African workers. Okay, and finally, let's head all the way down to the south and see what's going on in those colonies. And first, let's go to the British West Indies, because what's happening there will inform what's happening back on the mainland. So by far the highest concentration of enslaved labor in the British colonies was found in the British West Indies. So thanks to its proximity to the equator, these islands enjoyed long, warm growing seasons, and it quickly became apparent that the most profitable crop to grow here would be sugarcane. And like the Chesapeake region, the geography of the BWI became defined by these massive and sprawling plantations. And so as demand for sugar spiked throughout Europe, that created the need for more laborers to grow and process it. And then that in turn created a massive demand for enslaved laborers from Africa. And it wouldn't be long before enslaved Africans outnumbered the white colonists nearly 4-1. So that means society in the British West Indies was wholesale shaped by plantation agriculture and an abundance of slave labor. But it appears that while their heads agreed with that logic, their guts were a little more wobbly, because being thus outnumbered by black people got them all kinds of fearful and paranoid. And so to quench that fear and paranoia, they passed the Barbados Slave Codes, which was a series of laws that stripped all rights from black workers and granted white planters complete power over them. And that, as you might imagine, led to brutal and vicious treatment of enslaved laborers in order to keep them in their place, which I guess was the white people's best idea for decreasing black resentment against their white overlords. So, you know, whatever, it's not going to last forever. Anyway, I wanted to start with the BWI because now as we move up to South Carolina, we're going to see a lot of overlap. So this colony was separated from North Carolina in 1712 and was established as a royal colony. However, long before this, the colony specialized economically in the fur trade and providing food for the population of the West Indies. And why didn't they grow their own food in the West Indies? Well, because there wasn't any room on account of all those sugarcane plantations. But it wasn't long before planters from the West Indies started showing up in South Carolina and bringing their slave codes with them. And in doing so, South Carolina was gradually transformed into a kind of mirror image of the West Indies, except instead of majoring in sugarcane, they focused on growing rice and indigo. And since their growing number of African slaves had experience in rice cultivation, the system of slavery became entrenched in their society. However, it's going to be important to know that these enslaved Africans fought to preserve their own cultural and religious autonomy in opposition to all the efforts of planters to dehumanize them. For example, many West African slaves refused to accept the Christianity of their white masters, but instead syncretized Christianity with many aspects of their native West African belief system, Vodun. And one way they did this was by associating traditional Christian saints with Vodun spirits, and in that way African slaves were able to maintain their cultural heritage while giving birth to a new blended belief system. Anyway, in South Carolina, these strict slave codes quickly created a rigid social hierarchy in which a few wealthy planters were on the top, and then common white planters were in the middle, and then the dominant black population was on the bottom. And as such, these elite planters with their massive tracts of land dominated the affairs of local politics. Now, Georgia is also in this region, but it won't be till next period that it really starts to resemble its regional partners. I mean, it was just kind of established as a prison colony for British debtors, and more importantly, as a protective buffer between Spanish Florida and the wildly profitable Carolinas. And so let's sum up the southern colonies. First, the southern colonies were dominated by large plantation-style agriculture with massive populations of enslaved Africans. Second, the need to control the enslaved population led to the imposition of a rigid social hierarchy enforced by an elaborate system of race laws. Third, politics in the southern colonies was restricted mainly to decisions made by a small group of elite planters who wielded the most power. Alright, well done on getting through that one. You can click right here to watch my other videos for Unit 2, and you can click here to grab my video note guides, which are going to help you get all the content of this course firmly crammed into your brain folds. I appreciate you coming around, and I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Heimler out.